You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 535 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. Will is a staff writer over at RT. He has bylines at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this show. The most recent addition to Will's bio is he will be the co-host on the coming Conflicts of Interest podcast along with myself. And so make sure you check out the show notes page for today's show. So you can start to subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Twitter page, Facebook, and we'll be launching that in just over a week here. Will, what's going on? How you doing today?
Good, man. I'm ready to talk about some news. How you doing?
I'm all right. I think I'm doing better than you. I've managed to get through the week without watching too much coverage of the Democratic National Convention. To be honest, with this show, like what we do, there's not a whole lot to bring up because they don't talk a lot of policy. I mean, we're not going to break down the culture war stuff here. We're not going to, that's not really what we do. But I did manage to find this clip from the Morning Rising team that they put together on just some of the statements that we're getting about foreign policy to the extent, that I mean, even when you watch this, you'll realize that it's not like a policy prescription. It's not, we're going to get back in the JCPOA, but it is talking about what they think a Joe Biden's presidency will bring for foreign policy. And so here's a short clip. The first guy speaking is John Kerry. The second guy is Colin Powell.
Our troops can't get out of harm's way by hiding in the White House bunker. They need a president who will stand up for them, and President Biden will.
With Joe Biden in the White House, you will never doubt that he will stand with our friends and stand up to our adversaries, never the other way around. He will trust our diplomats and our intelligence community, not the flattery of dictators and despots. He will make it his job to know when anyone dares to threaten us. He will stand up to our adversaries with strength and experience. They will know he means business. I support Joe Biden because beginning on day one, he will restore Americans' leadership and our moral authority.
How important. All right. So, Will, I think if, we just talk to the average people, Colin Powell and John Kerry are two of the foreign policy kind of experts that we're all supposed to respect. And, here they apparently say the respectful things they're supposed to say. We're going to, stand up to world leaders, but get along with our allies. And, oh, what a fool Donald Trump has been, but it's all going to be better once we get these guys, back into the game, like a John Kerry, that are going to be, more respectful and play the game better on the world stage. So, Will, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, like the entire event, the entire Democratic National Convention has been just entirely full of platitudes. You don't really get much like specific policy proposals or anything like that. But it is kind of interesting to see just how like militaristic and warmongery Democrats can be, like especially during a general election when they really try to swing back to the center. So a lot of the time the Democrats will try to hide that a little bit. Typically they try to make themselves out to be sort of dubs. But, when you have Kerry up there saying, like really boasting about the troops, I don't really know what he even means. Like, what does he mean about like they can't go hide in a bunker? What is Biden going to do that's going to keep them out of harm's way or that's going to be so great for them? I don't know what it sounds like he's saying that like they're going to be more engaged with the world, but that's more liable to send them to get their limbs blown off halfway across the planet. So I don't know what he's even proposing that Biden would do that would be so much greater for the troops. And then in terms of Colin Powell, I mean, his is even more rich, I think. He had a little bit more of a longer statement at least. But one of his things was that how Biden is going to trust the intelligence community, which is just amazingly rich coming from Colin Powell, who infamously was tricked into helping to lie us into the Iraq War by selling the whole WMD thing to the United Nations. he had a major role in launching that. And, he's even talked about how that whole thing was a big intelligence failure. That's been his term for it. But yet here he is saying that, Biden, unlike the terrible Trump, will trust the venerable intelligence community. I found that a bit rich coming from Colin Powell.
No, yeah, that's a fantastic point, especially when we're have recent debates around, did Russia pay bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan? Now we have the claim that Iran also did, which I'm glad has been thoroughly mocked on Twitter. As much as I'm for taking the time and breaking it down like we did on the Russia show with the Taliban allegations, it's just, I think it's effective to see Dave DeCamp or Caitlin Johnstone just go, oh, next it's going to be China, next it's going to be North Korea, and just ruthlessly mock this stupidity on Twitter. But yeah, so I think it's very important to have, people in positions of power, especially now, that aren't going to be suckers and just go for whatever the intelligence community tells them, because the intelligence community is going to advocate for more war. We've seen that. And again, as you point out, Colin Powell's the best example of this, looking back to what happened during the Iraq War. All this is just so rich, I guess, kind of talking about how Trump hides in the bunker while they put troops in harm's way. Well, it is true that Trump has put troops in harm's way. If you look what happened in Iraq with the Soleimani assassination, the troops had to hide in the bunker from the Iranian missiles because of Trump's action. At the same time, had Colin Powell never existed, then maybe we're not in Iraq in the first place, and those troops aren't hiding there. And so the fact that neither of these two have any realization that, they're responsible for the position that American troops are in, as you say, is just extremely rich. And I think goes to a lot of the problems with, what I've seen with the Democratic Party, pretending that there's this systematic racism and all these systematic problems with America, but at the same time, just going back to the vice president from 4 years ago is suddenly this the progressive solution to everything. It is really silly and hard to understand how anybody could go for it. But I do think it was important for us to talk about on this show, because it is, this is Joe Biden revealing what his campaign or his presidency would be. And this is the foreign policy that we're looking at. It's not a good sign. So, Will, unless you have anything else to add on the DNC, I know you've done some other coverage there. But if you're ready to be talking about it, I completely understand, because I have tried to tune into a couple of the clips. Kamala was brutal. Hillary was brutal. And then the swooning over it on MSNBC has been something to behold. You would think these people would realize that they're the ones being pandered to. And then when they're like, oh, that was the greatest speech ever, it's like, lady, Obama was speaking for you, right? But anyways.
Right. I mean, every single speech that Barack Obama gives is his best speech. Not only his best speech, the best speech ever given on planet Earth in human history. But yeah, I'm pretty much done talking about the DNC. I've watched all 4 nights of it, the entire thing, to cover it. It's been grueling.
And I'm guessing you don't have a real sense of what Joe Biden's or even presidency would look like outside of just a couple more years of Obama. So.
Yeah, Obama, basically. That's the idea I get, is it'll just be Obama.
So, while we've been doing all this grandstanding and nothing at the DNC, the Trump administration has been busy trying to do the same thing at the UN. I guess maybe there's a little bit more of substance, but as far as the actual effectiveness of anything they're trying to do right now is going to go, it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. Last time I had you on the show, we talked about this vote at the United Nations Security Council where the Trump administration was looking to extend the arms embargo on Iran that's set to expire in October. The vote completely falls on its face. The U.S. and the Dominican Republic are the only 2 of the 13 UNSC countries to go for it. 11 countries abstain. China and Russia vote no. And it wasn't even close. And so after all that, the Trump administration is now coming back for round 2, Will, and looking to push snapback sanctions from the JCPOA. Tell us how this is supposed to work.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like it. Yeah, so we talked last week about that failed vote on the arms embargo, and ever since then, and I think even before that vote, they were threatening to do this, saying if that arms embargo vote fails, then we're going to try to, push for these snapback sanctions to be reimposed back on Iran in from the United Nations Security Council. And as I pointed out last time, this is like an important distinction, I think, to keep in mind, that the U.S. has brought back all of its own unilateral sanctions on Iran that existed prior to the 2015 nuclear deal. But there are a bunch of UN sanctions that remain suspended, that were on Iran, that they suspended under the terms of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And so that is now what the U.S. is trying to bring back. They're trying to revive or snap back those UN sanctions. And this week, the latest development we have on this, just on Thursday, actually, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has actually initiated the formal procedure to make that happen, to bring those sanctions back. And so he's traveled to New York, to the UN Security Council. He's written this formal letter to initiate that procedure to start, getting the sanctions back. And in his letter, he said that, Iran has done significant non-compliance with the nuclear deal. And that's their justification, I think, just narrowly in this letter. But what makes this kind of absurd is that, and Iran and the European parties to the nuclear deal have pointed this out repeatedly, is that Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018, and we're no longer a party to that agreement. And so now they're trying to have it both ways, where they want to invoke the terms and use the deal's powers to punish Iran while not abiding by any of its obligations. And the major obligation for the U.S. was sanctions relief for Iran. And as I said, we long ago restored all of our pre-deal sanctions on them. And of course, as would be expected, the Iranians have completely opposed this. They, the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, said it would be illegitimate and felonious to try to bring these sanctions back. And just like the vote with the arms embargo, the other four permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, China, the UK, and France, and also Germany too. Germany, there's a thing called the P5+1. It's the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. And so sort of like the arms embargo vote, all of the other Security Council members are against this. And they've totally, voiced opposition to these new sanctions. And Russia and China are pretty much guaranteed to veto any attempt to bring these sanctions back. And for that, Mike Pompeo has threatened to hit them with sanctions. He said if they try to block this vote, block this the reimposition of these snapback sanctions, that we would sanction Moscow and Beijing. But then also, the European parties to the nuclear deal, the UK, France, and Germany, have also come out against it. And obviously Pompeo didn't threaten them with sanctions, but he did come out and say that they're all siding with the Ayatollah now. So he's kind of jabbed at the EU parties who are opposing this effort. And now I think the Security Council has 30 days to bring another resolution to halt those snapback sanctions. And I expect they will do that, the Europeans and the Russians and Chinese. And of course, the U.S. will be able to veto that. So right now, what it looks like we're about to have is sort of like a bunch of dueling UN resolutions between the U.S., who wants to reimpose the Russians, the Chinese, and the Europeans, who have been against this and say this is not even legal because of the U.S. Abrogating the nuclear deal.
Right. And so one key thing about the nuclear deal was that if, say the United States did unilaterally leave the deal while the Iranians were complying with it and reimpose sanctions, the deal allowed for Iran to, start to comply less for the deal. That was part of it, is that if other nations aren't complying with it, all the letters of the deal, then you don't have to either. And so now it seems like all the U.S. complaints are just things that the Iranians have been doing since the U.S. withdrew from the deal and started to sanction Iran. And so that seems like a real problem for the U.S. case. And it doesn't really seem in any way to be based on what you would call integrity or trying to stick to the letter of the deal, but just as another failed attempt at the maximum pressure campaign. And so I kind of wanted to bring it there. And we've been at this for over 2 years now, because it was May of 2018 that the Trump administration officially withdrew from the deal. And then, that coming summer and the 3 to 6 months after is when we were reimposing the sanctions. And of course, it's been hell on the Iranian economy and everything like that. But what do you think this says for the maximum pressure campaign, Trump's Iran strategy as a whole? It kind of sounds like if this resolution gets defeated, then maximum pressure really doesn't work. And it doesn't seem like any other countries are really on board with it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly like the U.S.'s unilateral sanctions have taken a big toll on Iran. You know, it's really damaged their oil exports and all this stuff. Our stated goal, the U.S.'s stated goal is to bring those down to zero. And they've had some success doing that, hurting their oil exports and stuff and their petroleum sector, which is vital to their government and economy. But yeah, in terms of bringing the Iranians to the table for any kind of deal, which is Trump's stated goal, he said it over and over again that he can get a better deal with the Iranians than the terrible, what he calls the terrible nuclear deal, the worst deal ever negotiated. But it seems pretty clear that he's not going to be able to do that, that the Iranians are not budging. And it seems right now that they might even just be trying to wait him out, that maybe they think they can deal better with Biden. Barack Obama is, after all, his administration is the one who negotiated the JCPOA, and Biden was the VP there. And so maybe the Iranians are thinking right now that they'd have a better chance dealing with Biden, the Democrat, than Trump, because Trump has just shown himself to be totally unreasonable about this. I mean, he's apparently accepted fully the argument of the John Boltons of the world that you just have to keep on the pressure, keep on maximum pressure, and eventually they'll come to the table. But I mean, look at North Korea. We've talked about this a lot, that after decades of this pressure type of campaign with sanctions, it's done nothing to bring them to the table. And it seems whenever we do have any kind of diplomatic success with these countries, it's when we sort of like scale back our demands a little bit and, decide that we're willing to talk without just, telling them to give away the whole farm as a precondition to that.
Right. Well, I mean, Cuba's a fantastic example of that, right? The embargo has been going on there since well before either of us were alive. Multiple of our lifetimes before, and it has made no progress. I guess Obama opened up relationship a little bit. I don't know if it really did anything for the Cuban people or anything, but Cuba's long past time a threat to the U.S. The USSR is gone. The communist regime there is never going to make nukes or anything like that. Hell, we still have our torture base at Guantanamo Bay. It's not like the Cubans can even reclaim that thing. And so they're I think, pretty clearly not a threat. And why keep on these sanctions campaigns and the maximum pressure campaigns when all they do is, harm civilians? But it's, I think, that the general policy of the U.S. government and why, even for the Iranians, when it does come time to a Joe Biden presidency or something like that, who knows if it's going to get better, because it's so hard to roll anything back with the U.S. foreign policy. Even if Biden decides that, Obama liked the deal, so I like the deal, and goes to the Iranians to say, well, if you get back into it, I will too. The Iranians may be somewhat ambiguous on it. I mean, the U.S. sanctions have already turned their economy upside down again. And re-entering the deal, they may, see as a mistake, a waste of money or something like that, especially because, Biden's probably not going to be president for 8 years, much less 4. I'm not sure if anybody really is going to trust Kamala Harris to be the most reasonable or, integral person and, kind of hold to whatever deals Biden was making. So, I'm sure the Iranians will even have a lot of skepticism and questions about re-entry and deal with the Obama administration, as terrible as it definitely is to do with the Trump administration. Let's move on now, Will, and talk about this Israel-UAE deal. And we're getting more details about it, and I'm sure this is going to be a topic of conversation in the months to come, because it seems to me, and I guess this is the case, that the deal isn't fully set up, right? That there's still some negotiation that needs to go on between Israel and the UAE. Some of those negotiations are going to involve economic deals, security deals, all kinds of stuff. But I kind of want to look at it from the angle of what's going on with the U.S. And so we have here Trump saying he expects Saudi Arabia to join the deal with the UAE. And also we have Trump and other administration officials talking about the U.S. selling F-35s to the UAE, and there being some barriers around this because we say, Israel has to have the best military equipment in the Middle East. Netanyahu has objected to this, but for some reason I think it's going to happen. Just outside the arms industry being as powerful as they are. What's your take on this, Will?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll start with the Saudi thing, just because that's a little shorter. Trump, I think, had an offhanded comment recently where he said, "Oh yeah, the Saudis, all these other countries are going to totally want to join this deal after this." He says it's going to bring the peace to the whole Middle East and all this stuff, and he mentioned Saudi Arabia by name. I'm not totally clear, though. I don't know if he knows something that we don't, that he's been having, and perhaps he does. He is the president after all. So maybe he does have some idea that the Saudis are interested in this. But it could just be boasting as far as I can tell. Because I think the Saudis have put out a statement since this deal between the UAE and Israel. And they said something about like, yeah, sure, we'd be interested in some kind of, renewed talks or something. But they did still stick by their 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative that they put forward. And that does require that there is a Palestinian state. That's like a major, condition of them willing to talk. And so the Saudis are still saying that.
And so just to clarify there, because this is like, I think kind of a big deal for some Arab states. And I think it's like the standard, at least, of what, like, to the extent that the people of the Middle East have like a role of say or interest in what their government does. It seems like, the consensus really is this, again, 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which says that these Arab states won't normalize relations or make peace with Israel on several conditions, the biggest one being a state for the Palestinians, specifically based on the 1967 borders, which I think is important because that's nowhere near the situation in the West Bank or Gaza today is those 67 borders. And so for these countries to normalize relations with Israel, it's throwing this 2002 peace initiative completely out the window.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, definitely the UAE's act of doing this has. The Saudis, I guess, they're still at least paying lip service to that. I mean, we have seen the Saudis used to be a much more like militant, like unified Arab position against the Israelis, and now sort of like through the intermediary of Uncle Sam of the U.S., the great world empire, we've sort of helped to sort of ameliorate some of those ties between the Saudis and the Israelis. So that is an interesting possibility that the Saudis would join this. But the F-35 proposal or the suggestion, I think, is even more fascinating. So ever since this deal, I think just earlier this week, or was it last week or this week? I forget exactly when they signed the deal.
Last week was, I think, the big announcement. But this week we've gotten like the details and starting to roll out because initially it was just like a statement that Israel and the UAE are going to normalize relations and sign all these pacts and stuff like that. So this week we got in the details. Oh, it's about weapon sales.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So after this thing was announced last week, we've sort of been seeing some rumors and claims buzzing around that the U.S. has plans to sell the UAE the F-35, our like most cutting edge. It's supposed to be our most cutting edge fighter jet. It's got a lot of problems. It's had problems throughout its whole development. And I mean, Trump himself floated this idea, I think, on Wednesday during a press conference. He said something about how the Emiratis have all this money and how they would like to order quite a few F-35s, he said. And there have been, a few reports based on the claims of U.S. officials. You had one in the New York by now, but reports suggesting that, part of the deal between Israel and the UAE was based on guarantees from the U.S. that we would give the Emiratis like more access to our military hardware. And so that's what's being reported in some of these, some of these newspapers on the basis of the claim of U.S. officials. And so that apparently includes F-35s, giving them, access to those as well. And if you read the Times, if you believe what the Times reports, what these U.S. officials are saying, the U.S. has already actually given the Emiratis a classified briefing on the F-35. And so that might indicate that they are serious about going forward with this. The only thing, though, is that beyond Trump's like offhand comments, as far as I've seen, there's been no like official confirmation from the White House or anything. We haven't had any nothing on record, nothing like really concrete about this. So as of now, I'm not totally sure we know this is happening for a fact. But in the reporting, though, if you read it, these U.S. officials have not been disputing that there's an F-35 sale like in the works. What they were disputing, that at least in what I saw, was that it's not directly related to the UAE and the Israel deal. They're saying this is a totally separate thing that we've been negotiating on the side, that we're not rewarding the UAE for getting along with Israel with an F-35 sale. So that's sort of the position I've been seeing some U.S. officials staking out. But a weird thing, though, is that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has denied this. He's come out and said that, oh yeah, any report saying that there's going to be an F-35 sale to the Emiratis is fake news. And that, he said Israel would be totally opposed to any kind of sale. And so I'm not really sure what's going on behind the scenes there. I don't know if maybe Netanyahu is just playing dumb for his own political domestic, considerations, or maybe the U.S. really did sneak this behind the Israelis' back and weren't informed about this. I kind of can't imagine we'd side with the Emiratis over Tel Aviv. But again, I just don't know what the deal is, why Netanyahu would be denying it so starkly when you have other officials kind of suggesting this is the case. So that kind of seems like where things are at with the F-35 thing. Like nothing's really super nailed down, but we do have a lot of like reports and indications that, this may happen.
Yeah, so I have to imagine if there is like an actual discrepancy here between what Israel wants and what the Trump administration is talking about, there's going to be a really interesting like lobbying group battle going on behind the scenes between Lockheed Martin and Israel to try to influence policy here. And also the UAE has a lot of influence. I've noticed particularly Trump's ambassador to Israel, I think it's still David Friedman, has been saying that, we're looking at these sales. And I believe he also put forward at a similar time the possibility of Bahrain and Oman joining the normalization of relations with Israel. And so I was curious if that, this is maybe a way to try to entice some of the Arab states into doing it as well. Hey, you get better access to weapons if you get on board. It would be interesting to find out because it definitely seems like it was part of the discussions or agreement that the U.S. would sell the UAE some kind of different weaponry because they've normalized relations with Israel. Maybe not the F-35, but you have to wonder what else it would be, because I believe the U.S. has offered these states like Patriot missile batteries and stuff like that. And so I'm not sure what weapons we wouldn't sell them that we otherwise would. Maybe cruise missiles or something like that. So interesting, I guess. And I'm going to keep an eye out to see what other new weapon sales pop up to the UAE in the coming months. Another thing I want to mention, I think is pretty related to this subject, is I see here the U.S. Mike Pompeo came out and said that it's a U.S. interest and a goal to prevent Saudi Arabia from getting nuclear weapons. He mentioned this report that I think was highlighted by Israel, that Saudi Arabia is potentially working with the Chinese to develop some kind of yellow cake uranium processing facility. Maybe it's already going on, although again, this is just intelligence coming from the Israelis, which we always take with several grains of salt. But the claims are being made, and then Mike Pompeo saying this, I thought was at least interesting and worth bringing up, just because Saudi Arabia getting nuclear weapons, should that happen, would be such a game changer in the Middle East and really on the world stage geopolitically. And so, well, I just want to ask, have you heard anything about this? Do we have any better idea what's going on? As far as I know, it's just this report, and so it's something we'll have to just keep an eye on going forward. I mean, I know the U.S. was in pretty serious talks with the Saudis to sell them nuclear energy technology. We wanted to do it by this 1-2-3 agreement, where Saudi Arabia doesn't reprocess and refine their own nuclear fuel, which is the deal we have with the Emiratis. Although the Saudis don't want that, they want to have control over the fuel cycle and all that. So any idea what's going on in the background here, or anything else?
No, honestly, man, I haven't really heard much about nuclear energy transfer or nuclear technology transfers to Saudi in a while. The U.S. may be doing something with some kind of deal, but we were talking about that off air. You said that ran into some trouble in Congress. I kind of forgot. I'd lost track of what even happened there. But yeah, I haven't even heard about, I saw the most recent report that you're referencing here. But yeah, I haven't heard much about this in quite a while, in maybe like 2 years or something.
Right. You think it'd be like a huge story, the idea that we're going to sell nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. Like you said, most of it's happened like really in the background. We get like occasional reports out of it. And I know recently the congressional Dems were concerned that the Trump administration wasn't going by like the letter of what they're supposed to make this happen. And we've already transferred some information about nuclear technology when we're supposed to do it. But that just seems like the average kind of incompetence you're going to have anytime you put Rick Perry in charge of any branch of government. So let's move on and touch on what's been happening in Gaza. This I really haven't covered on the show. I feel like with COVID, the DNC convention, and everything else going on in the world, this has gotten very little to no attention. And yet it's a pretty serious situation for the people happening in Gaza right now. My understanding is the only power plant there has been shut down because there's no fuel. And Israel seems to be bombing about daily. Will, what's going on?
Yeah. So as you're saying, like the last, like it's been over a week now. I think it's been like 8 or 9 days solid that the Israelis have been bombing various locations in Gaza. That what they say is which I think we've talked a bit about on the show. Like starting after in 2018, the Palestinians did this thing called the Great March of Return, which was like a big series of gigantic marches they did at the barrier between Gaza and Israel. It's not really technically a border. It's not like a national border, but they do have like a big border wall there. And ever since that those protest marches, the Great March of Return, we've been seeing sort of an uptick in these incendiary balloon and kite attacks. And these balloons mostly don't do a lot of damage in Israel. They don't really injure people. The most they really do is they ignite brush fires, which isn't nothing. They do sometimes, damage Israeli farmland and, harm someone's livelihood or something, but certainly not like causing that much bodily injury as far as I've seen in Israeli press. But in response to those balloon attacks, there's sort of been like a real series of them lately. The balloons have been really picking up. In response to that, the IDF has been bombing what it says are Hamas sites all around Gaza. Hamas being the Islamist political party and militant group that's governed Gaza since like 2007, I think 2006. The Israelis have been doing a lot of airstrikes, just the standard like air raids, but I've also seen them using helicopters, and more recently they actually use tanks to shell some of these locations. And a lot of these targets lately they've been saying are underground targets. That's at least what Israel's claiming. And the Israelis call these terror tunnels, these underground sort of subterranean like bunkers that Hamas has. And I'm sure the military wing of Hamas does use these tunnels to some extent. But another thing that these tunnels are used for is smuggling goods. There's only like a couple of border crossings in and out of Gaza. And I think right now a couple of them are actually closed. The Rafah border crossing's been closed because of COVID for a while. And so they do use these tunnels to like smuggle goods and stuff. And so that's largely what Israel seems to have been targeting. But on a related note, they've also, in response to these balloon attacks, the Israelis have also shut down one of those cargo border crossings that's meant just for goods. The border crossing at Karim Shalom, which is way like at the southern tip of Gaza. And they also in the last week, they've also closed down a major fishing zone. It's like one of, a major like economic means for the Gazans is to fish off their coast, and they've shut that down. And then they've also shut down fuel shipments into Gaza, which, as you mentioned, has already resulted in them having to shut down their sole power plant there. Gaza has already had like really bad problems with rolling blackouts. I think they had like 8 hours of power per day. But now, because they've halted the fuel shipments into Gaza, I think they're supposed to have 4 hours of power a day if they're lucky. And that's not, that would be terrible if it's just your day-to-day life. But this also affects like hospitals and stuff too. Like, you can't run an ICU without electricity. And, this has had a major impact on like healthcare facilities in addition to just, everyday life in Gaza. And they are still getting a little bit of power coming in, but it's all from Israeli companies. It's all from outside of Gaza. So they're completely dependent on the Israelis now for all electricity and, can't generate any of their own. So in response to these balloon attacks, the Israelis have also been really tightening the blockade, in terms of shutting down this border crossing, stopping the fuel shipments, and closing the fishing zone. Because we should note that the Israelis have a blockade on Gaza, like a really intense economic blockade. They withdrew their like occupation force in, I think, 2005 in this big dramatic pullout they did. But ever since then, they've had this massive blockade on the Gazans. And that's what they've been really tightening the screws on ever since this like new wave of balloon attacks. And so, like, in response to all this, in the middle of all this, like, hostility and escalation, the Egyptians have tried to mediate things. They sent an envoy this week, but it doesn't look like that's done anything. Like, I think that was on Monday when they sent the envoy, and there have been strikes and balloon attacks, like, every day since. Israeli air raids every single day since. So that doesn't look great. However, right now, like, as far as I can tell, it doesn't look like this is going to boil over into, like a 2014 situation, like, what Israel called Operation Protective Edge. The thing that killed, 2,300 Palestinians, killed like 73 Israelis, 6 of them civilians. It does, like, before all that happened, there was like this big beat, drumbeat for war, this big buildup, and that's not really something we're seeing right now. It seems like this is all kind of happening like a little bit like being brushed under the rug. And, we should remember that there's a lot of stuff going on in Israel right now. Netanyahu has all these corruption charges hanging over him. He's got the coronavirus. He's got there's like a wave of protests right now, specifically protesting him, Netanyahu. So I don't know. Like on one hand, it seems like maybe a distraction would be useful right now, something like a war on Gaza. But at the same time, we're not really seeing the kind of buildup that we've seen in previous like Israeli incursions into Gaza.
Yeah. So I guess the thing that strikes me most about this is just how disproportionate it is. Where the Gaza, there's a few people that are doing these incendiary balloons, and like you said, they're in no way targeted. They just fly around, and they hopefully, I guess, from the people who are launching them standpoint, hopefully they would land somewhere near some dry brush and start a fire and cause some property damage. That seems to be the goal of these. And then Israel is using, these advanced weapons, dropping massive bombs, using tank shells and stuff like that. And so, I feel like it's kind of like throwing a rock at your neighbor's house and then he hits your house with a bazooka. It's like, there has to be some proportionality. I understand, some people will say, oh, self-defense. Well, self-defense is one thing, but there has to be some proportion there. The other problem is that, the self-defense argument lacks all the content stuff. Your neighbor, you throw a rock at his house, but he's making it so that you can't leave your house to go get food and your family's starving to death. And so you throw a rock out of anger and protest, you can't take it anymore, you're starving. And then he comes and shoots a bazooka at your house and says, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. And that's kind of his take. It's just, that's not what's going on here. And then the other issue, of course, is the collective punishment side of this, where, maybe you do have a small band of people in Gaza who are doing things that me and you won't want them to do. I don't think indiscriminately shelling southern Israel is the solution to this problem. Not that that's necessarily what's happening in this case, but even then, the Israel's response is to take the actions of a few militants and then collectively punish 2 million people who live in Gaza. Typically the first response to this is they'll shorten the fishing zone to make it so the Gazans can't get fish, hurts the amount of food they get. They'll close as you mentioned, border crossings. They'll limit fuel coming in. And so now the hospital in Gaza isn't going to have power because the actions of a few people. That's not something that's allowed to happen, or shouldn't be, at least. If you look at international law, it's clearly written under collective punishment that this is like a war crime. And even if you're not an international law person and don't care the hell the UN says or anything like that, just out of common decency, you can't starve babies to death because a few out of 2 million people who are under severe oppression are violent. And so those are kind of the big issues I see with it.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the time with these Israeli strikes and stuff, we don't always have real clear casualty numbers, but we do know for a fact that these, the blockade is, on the Gazans. I mean, we've seen Israeli documents talking about how they count Gazan calories, how they
From WikiLeaks,
they prosecute. Yeah. I think it was it might have even been Dov Weissglass, the Israeli diplomat, I think, who may have said that we count the Palestinians' calories. But they really implement the blockade in a scientific way. They know what they're doing. They intend to inflict pain on the Gazans. And yeah, just to kind of piggyback on the analogy you were using, yeah, it is like your neighbor sort of built a gigantic concrete wall around your house. You can't leave. You have no air, there's no airport in Gaza. There's no real way for them to get out. They're completely dependent on the Israelis and for a while the Egyptians. But the one border crossing into Egypt in Rafah, that's been closed for a while now because of COVID. So, and even when it is open, the Egyptians are not really generous to the Palestinians or anything.
Right.
It's not
Al-Sisi is Trump's favorite dictator.
That's right. Exactly. So yeah, it is just, there's an insane amount of, disproportionality going on here. I agree. I'm not for shooting rockets or even, flaming kites or balloons at innocent Israelis. They don't deserve it. That's true. They're not responsible for the things their government does. But nonetheless, we are seeing an insanely disproportionate response where, it's like some kid throws a rock and you drop a 500-pound bomb on his house. It's a bit uneven.
Right. And then just the other thing I wanted to mention that you went through there was the idea of the terrorist tunnels, just because this is such red meat for the Fox News audience. I don't know if you remember this. It was probably 10 years ago or more now. And who knows, Sean Hannity may have done it 3 or 4 times since then. But I remember this story. He's crawling through the tunnels and they're like, this one's under a preschool and this one's And it really does make a lot of red meat and makes people go, those evil Muslims are so terrible. Look at what they do. They exploit the children and all this kind of stuff. And, when you realize what's going on, the children of Gaza are starving to death because of Israel, not because of Hamas. That the situation in Gaza is what it is. The Israelis are the controlling and occupying power there. And yet they're never the ones that face any blame for what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. It's always framed in terms of, oh, Hamas just has to do every last thing the Israelis say, and unless they do, then it's their fault because hey, they're not. They could make this end at any time if they just gave in entirely, But I don't know. I don't agree with that take. Like clearly, the Israelis are the ones imposing this pain, and just demanding that the group who's sort of governing Gaza that they just do whatever you want. Like I don't know. I don't think them not capitulating makes it their fault.
Right. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for coming back on the show. I really appreciate it. If you don't have anything else to add, tell people where they can find your work.
Yeah, sure. If people want to see what I write, the best way to do that is to go check my Twitter handle. I'm at the Will Porter, so you can pretty much find everything that I write there. I'm on Facebook as Will Porter, and if you're no, you wouldn't be watching you'd only be hearing the audio right now. But yeah, Facebook is Will Porter, and I got author archives at the Daily Sheeple, Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, and antiwar.com.
Yeah, and with that, just another reminder that me and Will are August 31st, launching our new show, Conflicts of Interest. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and like the Facebook page. All the links will be in the show notes for this episode at the Libertarian Institute. The new show does include a video component, as we'll mention there. If you'd like to give us some feedback on that or, just check it out, you could do that by joining the private Facebook group. We've been trying to post the episodes in there and see what kind of feedback we have. Made some improvements. Finally got an HDMI cord now, so I can kind of look towards my camera while I'm talking on these things. And I know we got other stuff planned, so make sure you check that out. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle.